I want to know number 12 or whatever. I don't, 12's up. And yeah, we just answer what we can answer during our normal sermon time, and then just worship and prayer like normal. But I always start with some questions. I'm actually going to start with 2 questions that were asked. And so our first question I'm on the wrong slide thing. Maybe let's have those guys take over. There we go. I'm going to get it. Sunday night. I'm almost there. Ta-da! So someone asked, is Disney satanic? I don't make the questions, I just answer them. But you know, the first thing about this question, and it's sad isn't it sad? Anyone over the age of an undisclaimed number, isn't it sad that this is a question in a Bible Q&A, right? Isn't that just horrible that this has to be asked? Is anyone shocked that it's even asked? But the reality is that what is satanic? That's a great question to start things off, because that's something that gets thrown around a lot. That's of the devil, and it just kind of gets thrown out there. But in reality, is Disney satanic? Well, satanic, right? Is it influenced by Satan? Is it worshiping Satan? So when you ask someone, what do you mean by satanic? Here's what I'll say is Disney had some great roots. But with what's going on today, I'll just kind of jump to the where we're at now. Disney's definitely gone woke. I think it's hard to argue that one, right? It's pretty obvious that they are very pro with transgender stuff. If you don't have, Disney Plus, they have an entire LGBTQ playlist of shows to watch. So it's definitely woke. And wokeness, question, is, wow, what is wokeness, right? So here's the reality is there's kind of an interesting way of words. Being awakened, which is sad because revival, awakening, they're using our words against us. But the idea it was this idea of being awakened to the issues in the culture and the unfairness in the system. And there's all this stuff. So really, it's people who are woke. They've woken up to the horrible cultural, the one I want is not there, but the unfairness. Not the right word, but, and so they're really pushing and promoting. You see all these, my brain is not working tonight with all the acronyms and whatnot I want to be using. The critical race theory and all this kind of stuff. This all plays in with the wokeness. And so it's pushing then, we need to be really pro. So you see Black Lives Matters. You see the LGBTQ movement. You see, these are things that are really pushing this, we need to fight back. And so we need to be in your face with all this stuff. And Disney's really grabbed onto that. They have. And so, is it satanic? Well, I'll say this. I think the wokeness movement, the spirit of wokeness, and I mean that in the sense of just the general influence. We use that phrase spirit's another one you got to define, because I'm not talking about one spirit who's named woke, but the general atmosphere, which is absolutely influenced in the spiritual realm of pushing this. I think another area, I'm getting off from Disney a little, but as we prayed this morning, as Roberta prayed for the stuff with Israel, I mean, it is insane. It is insane what these college kids in these college campuses are believing. And while I was in Israel having dinner with a Jewish family, they're actually non-practicing, they're secular Jews, but just sitting there and talking with them and saying, there are 2 sides of a coin. This is going to get back to Disney, don't worry. Of the evidence of God's existence. It said, you want to hear 2 of my favorite arguments. On one side of the coin, the fact that there is a Jewish people, because it's mind-blowing and it defies the laws of history, that there is a Jewish people. Many of the Native American tribes are dwindling, and they can barely speak their native languages after 200 years of being displaced. It's a reality. The Jewish people were displaced for 2,000 years. They're speaking the same language. They're practicing the same religion. They are the same people. It's unheard of anywhere by 10 times fold anywhere else in history. So they're them being kept. But the other side is the hatred of the Jews. I can't think of another people group on the planet that's ever been so universally hated throughout history. Everywhere they've gone, after the diaspora, after they're kicked out of Jerusalem, after they're kicked out of Israel, everywhere they went, they were hated. You could take away the Holocaust. That was actually what was in my mind as we were doing prayer this morning, is you could take the Holocaust off the table, and I still think if you knew all the atrocities and the mass murders of Jewish people over the years, there would still be beating any other culture. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. And I think there's a satanic influence there. And I think there's a satanic influence behind wokeness, and Disney has bought in. What do you do with that? That's a conviction thing. That's a Romans 14 and elsewhere where, do you want to support a company that does this? That's up to you. Because once again, if you go look at all the companies that support bad things, we would be eating very few foods and we'd be going to very few places. So we have to make that decision on, do I want to invest my money in a company that's obviously going a certain direction? They bought out Star Wars. I have a moral dilemma, right? I mean, this is the idea, is that Disney now has Star Wars. I love Star Wars. I grew up on Star Wars. Well, now Star Wars is Disney. And episode 9, there was a girl and girl kiss at the end of the movie. It's there in the background, but they put it in for a reason because Disney owns it now. So now it's like, well, great. Everything you know, it's all gone. So is it satanic? I don't think I would say Disney is satanic, but I would say that in their current state, they're definitely being influenced by the wokeness that is definitely, I think, spiritually driven, satanically driven. It's being propelled by satanic forces. So there's an answer to that. Second question, which actually trails. To answer this, there's actually multiple questions that people asked, and they all kind of came together. So after this, we'll open it up. But this is kind of longer, but in short, did Jesus start the Roman Catholic Church? I was sent a bunch of, Instagram and TikTok and all these other short clips, that are Roman Catholic apologetic defense clips, and they're making all these claims. And so this ties in with all this stuff. Was Peter the first pope? Was the Roman Catholic Church before the New Testament? I heard they're saying, well, the church came before the Bible. And so, when people would say Bible, but the church came first. Are all other denominations just breaking away from the one true church? And how do we talk to people about this? I want to answer the last part first. How do you talk to people about this? Anytime we have people who are off in doctrine, and I'm going to say it that way because the Catholic Church isn't a cult. Some people might take it that way, and you can be part of even a good church and treat it cultically, if that makes sense. You can kind of take it a little too extreme. But it's under the umbrella of Christianity, right? There's an umbrella, which the three main parts is the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Protestant Church, where we fall under, and most denominations fall under. And the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, they have their continual boxing match of, we're the one true church, or we're the one true church. We're the one, we have 12 apostles. Well, we have one pope. And it's kind of funny because they're really like two sides of a coin fighting back and forth over who's the real one true church. But how do you talk to people when they're in these churches that hold the weird doctrines? And there's more that I can list in one night, but it's just Bible studies. It just is Bible studies, right? And I won't name Enrique by name, but the point is like, we talked when he was starting the Spanish study. When I first started the youth study, and there's a couple of you who were in the old original youth study, it used to be mostly Catholic kids. Getting a nod in the back. Give me a nod. Okay, he's nodding. But it was a lot of Catholic kids. And his Spanish study is a lot of Catholic families. What do? Teach the Bible. Just teach the Bible and study the Bible, because most Catholics aren't like anti-Bible. They're not going to and it doesn't matter what church it is. You have friends who go to a kind of a cuckoo church and they got weird beliefs. Study the Bible with them. Do you want to do a Bible study together? And as you go verse by verse through the scriptures, questions get answered on their own. You don't need to jump straight to talking about Mary, jump straight to talking about Peter. Just go through the Bible, and as they see truth and truth and truth and truth, when they get to the hard truths, they'll realize, well, this whole time we've just been faithfully seeing what God has to say. Man, that sure looks like Jesus has brothers and sisters. Well, we have an issue now with the perpetual virginity of Mary, that she remained a virgin forever. And so that's the way you talk to people. Now, as far as some of these claims that were getting made, and I won't chase down all of them, but this whole idea that the Catholic Church was the first church, and I watched a short series of videos that was shared with me, and it's, here's the reality. 1 Corinthians 12:13, for by one Spirit we're all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slave or free, and all been made to drink into one Spirit. Ephesians 4:5, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. That is as true today as it was when Paul wrote it. There is only one true church, and it is made up of every single born-again believer, no matter where you attend church. because when I write, I tell people, like, I'm very specific with words. Sometimes I can be confusing, like, well, I use that specific word for that specific reason. But capital C and lowercase c, I am very specific with. With a capital C in church, I'm talking about the worldwide body of Christ. And when I use a lowercase c, unless it's the revival church, it's a title, right? But when I talk about I went to church, that's a lowercase c. It's a local body of believers. It's one building where we meet together. And there's another church next door. There's another church around the corner. There's another church down the block. But we're all part of the one true church. So when they talk about, well, Jesus started the one true church, the Catholic Church, well, in reality, the one true church was just the believers. They were all believers. And there was no formalization of the Catholic Church until the 4th century. There is nothing you could even remotely call a Catholic. And Catholic is Latin for universal, in case you didn't have that one down. It's universal. So actually, you can even read like older Protestant writers who talk about the Catholic Church, but they're not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. They're talking about the Church Universal, the one church. And so there was nothing you couldn't, I can't find any way I'd argue that any of these churches, it was just people making disciples, people making disciples, people making disciples. And as the church grew, they started running into some issues of people having differing beliefs. And so they would try to keep it all together. And that's where they started having the councils, Council of Nicaea and all this stuff. People down in Alexandria, which was a major hub for Christianity, were disagreeing with the people up north over the deity of Christ. So they had to have the Council of Nicaea to try and knock that out. And what do we believe? But the reality is that, and the question was asked, what is a denomination? Why are there so many? And who made up all the denominations we have? You see, when you have two people who have two different beliefs, you can either say, well, we're just Christians. And that's the reality. But I go to a church over here that believes something slightly different than this church over here, and those are denominations. That's kind of the long and short of it. The church has always been made up of Christians who share a common faith, but sometimes don't see eye to eye on smaller points. And that's how denominations got started, was people were following one pastor over here, and people were following a different pastor over there, and you started finding there were different groups. And I think in the early church, I sent Caleb, I was reading a bunch of early church father quotes from the first 300 or 400 years of the church. And you can see Irenaeus and Tertullian and Origen and all these guys, they were, the goal, they were trying to keep it one church with just one theology and one doctrine. But with the spread and so many new people and so many churches, it was hard to keep it all together. And you'd find that there were different groups. And so as far as the Catholic Church being the original church, you can't really make the claim. It's really hard to do that. But as far as denominations are concerned, today we have many different denominations, and the Catholic Church is just a denomination, is what it is. And the Eastern Orthodox Church and the different branches of it is just a denomination. And the charismatic Catholics is just a denomination kind of branch of the Roman Catholic Church. And there are Protestant denominations. And just like every church, there are believers and unbelievers, wheat and tares in every church body. Some are made up of more wheat than tares. Some are made up of more tares than wheat. The healthier the church, you're going to find more wheat and less tares. Churches that usually have very off doctrine or whatever, you might find more tares, but I wouldn't deny that there's wheat in there. I know many born-again Catholics. I think that they would probably grow better in a different church. But I know many born-again Catholics. And so this idea of denominations, why are there so many denominations? Because people see things differently. And this is where it was Augustine who talked about, that in the things essential, we must have unity. I bring up like the Apostles' Creed, right? With the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, that Jesus died and was resurrected and he ascended into heaven. Like, these are essentials we must agree on. But then there are those things that are kind of, they're non-essential. They're non-essential. How do we take communion? It's not essential whether you come up and take it or we pass it out. Do people want to dip it? Do they want wine or do they want grape juice? Do they want this? Those are not essential things. We can have different beliefs on those things. And in those things, unity. So he said in essentials, or unity, in non-essentials, charity or love is the idea, grace. And then in everything, love. Yeah. Something like that. I didn't prepare that quote. But the whole point is that we be flexible with different things, and this is the last two parts of the question. So what should a family do when they can't find the right church to attend? Come here. Problem solved. No, but the reality is no, like people, I know many people, and I have had people who I felt pushed back at me. This is like Facebook friends. They pushed back, they defended their choices. They weren't attending a church because there was no good churches. And after a year and a half or 2 years of little minor pokes and prods of my posts on Facebook, and you know what? I'm thankful we're attending a church now. It doesn't have everything we wished, but we're faithfully attending a church now. And we realize we should have been. And people can't find the perfect church. And that's the reality, is you won't find a perfect church. You're not going to find a church where everything is perfect, because if you did, you'd ruin it. And that's the old Spurgeon and other people made that joke. And if you went to the perfect church, you'd ruin it. And so, but find a church that's a good church. Find the best church you can find. And I've told people to put their money where their mouth is. Well, there is no good church. Fine, start one. I mean, if you know so well what is a good church and a bad church, and nothing can meet that standard, then obviously you're the one. You're the one. Start inviting people to your house. But fellowship, start a church. Like start inviting people. On Thursday nights, we meet at my house. We're doing a Bible study and that's how I started in Grandview. I moved to Grandview and I started a Bible study in my living room. And then there was already, this church was here and we brought our groups together. But I mean, that was my mindset. And great little saying, don't find the church that's closest to you. Find the church that's closest to the Bible. And so before I finally get to the last, which is like part B to this exact question, biblical is the most important thing when finding the right church. I will challenge everyone here and say the last thing you should leave a church over is the worship. Because a lot of people, I don't like this kind of music. I don't like that kind of music. It's too loud. It's too quiet. You know what, though? If you have a church between churches, I've seen people, I've had people, I find more people my age to hang out with. We don't go to church for friends. And the music's an important thing, but that's not why we go to church. I want a church with a solid biblical belief system that is as close to the Bible as I can get, and I hope they have worship that I like. I have no problem, right? I'm a pastor, right? But imagine I wasn't. We went to a town, the best Bible teaching church only does hymns. That's fine. I like contemporary worship, but I grew up on hymns. But it's like you go to a church, and I'm the only young person there. Been there, done that. My early years as a Christian, it was like me and my one friend were the only young people in the whole congregation. But we were taught the Word of God, and that was what was important to us. And so the last piece of this long series, what should a family do when some want to go to one church and others want to go to a different church? So here's what I would say is there is a flow chart of submission in a family. That's one thing to consider. So if you're a typical married couple with kids go where parents go. As they get older, you can kind of let them free. I've had kids start coming to this church, upper teenagers, and eventually parents followed, or parents stayed. But, that's one thing, is that obviously if you're talking about, your 12-year-old doesn't get to pick his own church. They go with you. When the husband and wife can't decide, you become a little bit more in a pickle, especially when it becomes like a small difference. If you're talking about a small difference, like a preferential thing, I would advise wives to follow their husbands, especially if your husband's adamant about attending a church. Praise the Lord, right? There's a lot of women who don't have that. You should just be thankful he wants to attend a church. But you know what? If you got a guy who's on the fence, well, I really want to go to this church. Okay, I'll go there when you go. But if you're not going, I'm going over here. Because that's another side of things. It's like, now if it's a church with false teaching, something that's just, this is absolutely wrong and it's not glorifying God, and it's like, there's a place where you have to obey God before man. And so, nope, like I can't go over there. And this could be just an unequally yoked couple. I mean, we've had people where, one person's Jehovah's Witness and the other person's not. So it's like, well, I'm not going to go with you there. I'm going to go over here. But realistically, again, if you can let go of some of your preferences so you can go as a family, I think that is important. That's good. But again, there's other situations where families come up with their own unique things. So I've seen families do things different ways all the time. I think ultimately a whole family worshiping together is the best case scenario. And especially, again, like husband and wife, when they can together. But I've seen unique things too. So, but if you guys are aiming for the most biblical church and everyone in the family's on that same page, hopefully they can find a church that meets that requirement. All that said, do we have our little rotatey list still available? Yeah, and I've known we've had other people from our church here who. Yep, and it is. I've seen people do different churches, and I think, and your husband goes to the Catholic church. And I think that's another. It's a big enough difference that it's kind of like making that decision. And so, yeah, I would hate to see people going to a different church just because, again, of like the worship or because of some little, kind of a smaller thing or whatever. But all right, we have a list of questions. You could ask a fresh question. You can ask a question off the list. I've told people online if they wanted their question answered, they should let people know. Just shout out a number for me, and I can do it. Silence. Boom, yes. Okay. That is something that the Bible does not give enough explicit information to be dogmatic. But many people do believe it is when you go to be with the Lord. So if it's death, rapture, like whatever the case may be, that seems to be a logical argument I've heard made. And I would say it's probably the logical argument that I'd subscribe to. But on that note, there's nothing that gives us enough information to be like, this is exactly when it happens. A lot of the other events, the white throne judgment and all that other stuff, like those things you can pinpoint in time. The Bema Seat one is just more of a logical argument. I think it's going to be when you come to be before the Lord. You're immediately before the Lord. You're absent in the body. You're in his presence. You deal with that stuff, and then you enter into glory. So that's what I think is, when will the Bema Seat judgment be? Next, number 9. I'll scroll down here. Can a Christian lose their salvation, or are you once saved, always saved? Let's see here. Where's my picture I want for that one? Do you guys have my picture? I made a meme. Okay. I don't know if you're supposed to make memes for serious things like this, but seriousness is not my strong point. I love the Joey and Phoebe meme. Right? You repeat after me. You are saved by grace. You're saved by grace. And you're kept by grace. You're kept by grace. You're saved by grace. You're kept by grace. You're saved by grace. You're kept by works. And that's the whole theme of the meme, is he never can finish what she says right. Here's the reality is, I'm going to say there's two sides of this spectrum. And there's a point where I think it's hard to even say there are some things that are hard to get pinpointing on. Lots of people want to put their, it's so easy. I don't think it's so easy, but the reality is this, is that when we become saved, most all Christians believe we're saved by grace through faith. It was God's grace that saved us. So what keeps us is God's grace that keeps us. I think we all agree the gospel is not get saved by God's grace and then keep it by being really good. But it's when things get really drawn out. See, if you want to get people to believe in evolution, you have to say it happened billions of years ago. Because when you go so far down a line, then things that didn't, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now things can be imaginable that weren't imaginable previously. And so, well, if you're really, 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 really bad, then you'll lose your salvation. Well, the hard part, again, is, well, I was saved by grace, so am I kept by my works? Am I kept by my works for a little while or for a long while? The other thing is, when you're saved, you're born again. A good question for people is, how would one become unborn again? This is a long question. So I would say this is, I have come to the point where I realize that no, I know as my pastor, and some of the men who were at the men's conference, Tony was here, and he's the one who told me when I was young in my faith, he goes, Joe, I know that I'm once saved, always saved. I just can't speak for you. And he meant that in the way that he said that I know that the experiential relationship that I've had with Jesus Christ, being born again, that the old things have passed away and that all things have become new, he goes, I know that nothing can change that or take that from me. But what if someone starts to just, go way off the deep end and start denying Jesus? Well, first off, how many of us ever ran away? But not when you were like a teenager. I ran away when I was like 4. I used to have a panda backpack. It's not a backpack with a panda on it. It looked like a full-blown stuffed animal panda that I would wear on my back. Had a big panda head. And when I wanted to run away, I opened that thing up, the drawstring, and I shoved that thing as full with VHS tapes as I could. Every one of my movies, I knew where my treasure was. I filled it with VHS tapes, and I head out the door. And my parents let me go. And as I was standing 2 blocks away, they kind of waved me down, and I came home. We're God's kids, and God's kids can get really foolish sometimes and do really stupid things. I think if we've been adopted as his sons, again, I just don't know where biblical emancipation paperwork comes from, but if we've been adopted as his sons and we want to be stupid and foolish and walk off the deep end, I think God's watching us with our panda backpack full of VHS tapes going, yeah, I know where their heart really is at. Here's the reality too, though. It makes it very difficult. This is a difficult thing, is that the parable of the sower speaks about seeds sown in stony soil. And this sprouts up what looks like a plant. But when the sun comes out, trials and tribulations, it dies because it had no real root. I always tell people, the parable of the sower, we have really bad. It's obviously, I hate God. That's easy, the first soil. The last soil, making tons of fruit, that's easy. But the middle two are always hard to tell apart because one looks like a Christian, but it turns out they weren't. The other one's not really making any fruit, but they're alive. They have thorns in their life. They're not making fruit. And so the reality is it's so hard to tell. Did the person lose their salvation or were they a false convert? And at one point, I was having a little debate with my diehard Calvinist, 5-point Calvinist friend, and we were going back and forth. And the one thing we ended on was this. I challenged him because I was pushing back a little bit with him on this subject. I said, but at the end of the day, if we see someone who is obviously far from the Lord, should we assume they lost their salvation? Should we assume they were never saved? Or should we not care and just try and get them back close with the Lord? And at the end of the day, do you want to bank on, they gave their life to the Lord back in 94, and now they're a drug-dealing heroin addict, and and this and that and everything. This horrible rap list is all I know is that the safest bet for me is to worry about lost souls and people who look like lost souls. But as far as the believer is concerned, the person who's walking with the Lord, I would tell them, you have nothing to fear. You're not going to mess up, because there's extreme ends of people acting like, every time you sin, you lose your salvation. I remember hearing Greg Laurie speak 3 or 4 days after his son died in a car accident. And I remember hearing him share that day, and it was so powerful. And I remember years later, he was talking about how people were telling him that his son had gone to hell because he sinned right before he died. This is the extremes of, this idea that, you lose your salvation every time you sin. So it's crazy to see where this spectrum goes. I would tell every believer, you have nothing to fear because you are saved by grace and you'll be kept by grace. And even if a true believer puts up a hissy fit and does some really stupid stuff, God will chase you down in your panda backpack and he'll bring you home. But if it's us dealing with other people, I am not going to just bank on a security I know they're saved even though they look absolutely not saved at all. If it's someone I love and care about, I'm going to treat them like an unsaved person. I'm going to try and win them back to the Lord. So as far as where the rubber meets the road, I love believers to have total assurance of their salvation and the security of it. And we're talking about other people whom we don't really know their hearts, and we never know where their hearts actually were, no matter how much evidence we've seen. I just don't care whether they were saved or not. I just see where they're at, and I try and deal with them where they are at. So hopefully I answered, but the short answer is that yes, I believe that Christians, if you're born again, I don't know how to unborn someone. Put him back where he came from, or so help me. I don't know how do you put a baby back? If you're born again, you're born again. And so There's that. 13. Oop, wrong 13. I think I did. Yes, my numbers got a little mixed up down here. All right, yes. Is it okay to drink if you're not getting drunk? A drink with wine? Yeah, I basically did answer that this morning. The Bible absolutely does not forbid drinking, but speaks with great strongness against drunkenness. And so the information I gave this morning simply was the context of the history of what the disciples were like, what Jesus was like as they drank wine, so that we can keep that in our consideration when we try and make modern day choices. And again, we see that there were people. Timothy was obviously not drinking because Paul had to tell him to drink some wine. And again, the whole point there is the idea that water would go bad. When a tall ship, sailing days in the polar period, when they were coming to America or whatever, they would bring more alcohol than water with them, because the water would run out before they could get to the Americas, but the wine would stay good. The beer would stay good. And that's how they stay hydrated. In fact, it's hard to fathom the drinking allotment of a British sailor back then. It was something like, what was it? It was like, it's like they get every day, they get like 8 pints of beer, 3 cups of wine, and a half a cup of rum or something like that. It was like their daily alcohol allotment. It's insane. But there's that. So I answered that this morning. I did have someone ask some questions online. Have you had problem understanding a King James version, and what version of the Bible do you recommend? I can give you the short version. I am of the New King James Mostly camp. Instead of the King James only, I am the New King James Mostly. The King James Bible is a great Bible. I really do like it. The Old King James, that is. I love some of the wording, the poetry. I mean, it has a way it rolls off your tongue. When we say the Lord's Prayer, I mean, it just sounds right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It just sounds right. But I get it when people don't understand it. That's one reason why I like the New King James, because it really just keeps a good translation, and it gets rid of some of the vowel. It makes the verb endings and things that make it more difficult to understand. What I would say for people in Bible translations is there's two categories. There are word-for-word translations where they took the Greek and the Hebrew and they try and make it in English straightforward. And then there are thought-for-thought paraphrases. So the NIV is a paraphrase. The NLT is even more of a paraphrase. The Message is so much of a paraphrase, it's almost like a commentary on the Bible. And it was actually my wife who first coined that to me, and I actually liked it when she said it that way. Like, it's almost a commentary, because it's like they take one verse and they make it a paragraph, but that's not necessarily bad, because I read commentaries. I've read things out of the Message version. I treat it more like a commentary, because so much has been added. When you come back over here, you have the King James, the NASB, the ESV, and these are word-for-word translations. So if you're looking for a Bible, one thing is how academic are you intending to be? Because if you want accuracy, these are the ones you're going to want. If you struggle with reading, if it's not your favorite thing, if you really I'm reading, but I get nothing out of these, then stop reading them. If you don't get anything out of it because of just your aptitude for reading or whatever it may be, I highly advise the New Living Translation to people. I don't use it very often, but I love cross-referencing it every now and then to see how it compares with my Bible. And so there's lots of good Bibles, but I'll quote David Guzik, the best Bible translation is the one that you'll regularly read. I could go longer on Greek stuff. That's actually why I like the King James, is some of the Greek that they use. There's different manuscripts, and there's more to that. But, yeah, so that's on the Bible questions. I did have one more question online, and I'm going to focus on you guys again in a second. My question moved right as I went to look at it. Well, they just missed out on that then. So while they're dealing with where my question disappeared to, any other questions? 3. Is 3 still 3? Is that the New Testament, the Old Testament feasts? No. Yes? Aha, number of there. My questions got moved, just so you know. Maybe I'll pull up I'm just going to pull up ProPresenter, but then I won't be able to see it. Sorry. We had a shift of things. We're learning as we go. All right. There we go. Number 3. How did God dwell with Adam and Eve in the garden if he's an unapproachable light? And then was God physically talking with people in the Old Testament? So in the Old Testament, we have two terms, two Bible theology terms. One is a theophany, where it's theos, the Greek word for God, and the other is Christophany, Christ. And it speaks of Old Testament appearances of God, where he physically shows up. Now we have this God dwells in an unapproachable light. There's something about the Father. And once I heard a pastor make this comment, and I've never been able to contradict it, where he says, never in the Bible really do you see God other than on the throne in this inapproachable light. And even in heaven, he goes, I don't even know if we'll see the Father in heaven, or if you'll just see this so powerful, so bright, so awe-inspiring light, but you will see the Lamb of God next to him at that throne. I think in the Old Testament, when you see God show up, you see Christ coming, because that gets rid of any contradiction there. And I think what's really helpful to understand this is Moses had a unique experience with God the Father that no one else ever had. And Moses, he put him in a little rock cove, closes his eyes, walks past, uncovers his eyes, and he gets to see the wake, as I like to describe it, like a wake of a boat. You never saw the speedboat, but you saw the waves after the boat went by. That's what Moses got to see, and the way it's described, that's unique. Like Moses got a special glimpse, a unique view of God no one ever else got. So if that's what Moses got, then what were other people seeing? And it's Christ. And what you find is in the Old Testament, there is the phrase, the angel of the Lord, with that definite article, not a angel, but the angel of Yahweh. And he shows up first to Hagar. Now we see God in the garden. I think it's the same person we're seeing. It's Christ showing before he came as a babe. He's showing up. He shows up to Hagar, shows up to Gideon, the burning bush. It says the angel of the Lord was in the bush, and then Yahweh speaks. 3 men appear to Abraham. 2 go off to Sodom and Gomorrah. 1 man stays, and Yahweh starts talking. So we see these appearances as man. Jacob wrestled with someone. He wrestled with God and lived. And Hosea even clarifies, like in case there was any question in Genesis 32, Hosea clarifies he wrestled with God himself. Well, who was he wrestling with? And Christ is really the only answer that we can give. The Jews have a bigger struggle than we do. And so you see that throughout the Old Testament is the angel of the Lord appearing. And it's also worth noting, right? In the Revelation, John sees angels that they're so awe-inspiring, these angels. And he falls down like to worship them. And the angel says, don't do that. You're embarrassing me in front of my friends. And he tries to pick them up, right? And stop that, stop that, stop that. Yet, when Joshua sees the angel of the Lord, that angel says, you take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. And he allows Joshua to come up and worship him. So once again, you see the angel of the Lord receiving worship as God. You see him doing things only God can do. And so that's the idea in the Old Testament. So how did God dwell with Adam and Eve specifically? I think it was Christ walked with them in the garden. It's the best answer I've ever had as far as that not contradicting other stuff. And so we've got that. Let me see this thing. Okay. Mark 10:40. But to sit on my right hand, my left is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared. Does the Bible tell us who it is prepared for? You know what? The best answer I can give to that on the spot, the 24 elders are up there. Who are the 24 elders? That's a great question. You should have asked that instead. Revelation speaks of 24 elders. Now, people hypothesize. I think they're people. Because there's some camps that think they're angels. There's actually, it's Revelation. It's tough. But I think they're people, and I think a great possibility, people talked about the heads of the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles, but it could also be a select group of people. But there is going to be people sitting around the throne. There's these 24 elders. They're people who have been given this great privilege to sit around the throne. And so when Jesus says, I don't get to choose who sits on my right and my left, that's for the Father. And I think the elders is the best candidate for who those people are going to be. All right. Next. Which one? Oh. I know, right? So in Isaiah 9:6, the title's there, Wonderful Counselor, and it gets down to Everlasting Father, and Mighty God is right before that. Is the best I've got on that, honestly, it's something that's pointing to the Trinity. It's pointing to this idea. And Everlasting and Father, that'd be a good one on a Hebrew study. And it's one, actually, I haven't gone into great depth on that, but it is something where I've pointed to people who've denied the deity of Christ when it's like, well, no one seems to deny that that verse is about Christ. And here he's called Mighty God. He's called Everlasting and Father. Some of those, it's actually fascinating. Is it Everlasting Father or is it Everlasting ... Father? So, but at the end of the day, the best I can give is that it does point to the Trinity and the triune nature of God, is that you've got all these qualities that can be spoken of the one he's going to send. And so that's the best I've got for right now, but that'd be a fun one for me to study some more in depth on. All right. I'm going to start calling on names. I'll do it. Enrique. Question on war.
And to add to that before you go on.
Sure.
Let's say the nation you're defending is
Okay. You've added a whole layer of complexity now. So first off was someone was just asking a series. It was pretty much the whole who, what, where, when, why, how on war. And then part B of the question now is how do you handle it if it's a wicked nation that you're being asked to fight for? So the first off, as far as war goes, well, God commanded quite a few battles and wars in the Old Testament. So right off the bat, we know it's on the table of something that God has said to do. Why? It's sad that, he's not a great reference these days, but I remember long ago listening to Ravi Zacharias talk about this, and one thing he talks about is because of the sanctity of life. War is a necessity because of the sanctity of life. That life is precious, and when there are people out there who are attacking life, they are taking lives, they are doing things that are going to hurt the innocent, that opens the door where stopping those people becomes okay. Because you can take war and you can scale it on down to really like, what about if someone, the men in the room here, I don't know, maybe you're a naturally aggressive and angry and mean person. I'm not necessarily. I don't necessarily like, I'm not like an angry person. I don't typically have aggression issues. I like to mess around with my friends, but if someone did something to my wife or kids, my nature could change quickly, and I would feel justified. Absolutely justified to protect them. I'm not talking about even revenge. I'm just talking about to defend. Someone is attacking my daughter. What won't I do? That's the question. So now we put it onto a grander scheme. And I think this question gets prompted because of Israel. So I'm backing over to your part B, but the who, what, where, when, why of war, well, man, right? Like, Israel's been attacked with rockets, suicide bombers, the Intifada, it goes on and on and on. But when hundreds of people, they come through the border in the middle or the early morning, not the middle of the night, but the early morning, and they rape tons of women, kill people. I mean, it's horrific. If you've never really looked at the details of what was done that day, I mean, it is sickening and barbaric. And there's a point where you say, like, we can't let this happen again. Like, we've been dealing with missiles. We created the Iron Dome. We can't let this happen again. And so there are points where we realize life is on the line. Lives are being taken. It's tough. Like, when does our nation step in? When does America step into Sudan? When does America step into these other? That's a hard call, but at the same time, what happens when you have Ben Parker, right? With great power comes great responsibility. There's my Spider-Man quote of the night. But the idea is, though, right? Like, you have the ability to stop evil. And so how do you go about it? Well, I mean, fight fair. We have international laws. Israel's going by all the international laws in that battle. And so the who, what, where, when, why, and how, I mean, that's the main thing is God has allowed us to defend ourselves. That's that whole talk about the two swords in the Last Supper, you know. Well, you have the two swords. Why? Well, to defend yourselves. He wasn't opposed with the apostles. He also wasn't opposed to them walking to the gallows, you know, but at the same time, God is not against us defending ourselves in the sanctity of life, doing what it takes to protect people. Now, as far as we're supposed to obey the governing authorities, and really your part B is almost more of that kind of a question, right? The obeying of the governing. What do you do when I'm being asked to participate in a war, but this nation is wicked, this and that? And really just kind of goes back to answering the when do we have to follow the government? When do we have to obey the governing authorities? And it's, well, you have to obey God and not men. And the Holy Spirit will convict. That's another part of that too. When the Holy Spirit convicts us. So I'd be dealing with that more on a unique one-on-one basis. But again, it's not hard when if a nation's doing something that you feel like, no, this is absolutely ungodly and unbiblical, well, then I wouldn't feel compelled to participate in that. So I hope that kind of got the part B, is it really kind of runs over into that 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13, you know, kind of a category of if my nation's doing a draft, and it's like one of those things, is it a just war? And a lot of Christians got out of the draft for religious reasons. So there are many people who felt that things were, you know, not okay, and they got out of it for that reason. All right. Oh, in the back. That's a great question. So the parable of the fig tree, Matthew 24:32, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches have already become tender, it puts forth its leaves. You know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near and at the doors. Surely I say to you, this generation will no means pass away till all these things that take place. So there's a couple of things here. I'll get to the what is a generation second, but there's two things about the fig tree we can look at, two sides of a coin. On one side, Jesus just gave us a list earlier in the chapter of signs that would be happening before the tribulation. Verses 4 through 8 of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, he says in verse 8, all these are the beginning of sorrows. Then, and that kind of kicks, now we're moving into the time period of the 7 years. So there's going to be the wars and rumors of wars and all this stuff. So part of it is just paying attention to the signs, but I think also it'd be very hard for the disciples who just the day before watched him curse a fig tree and it die, not have that image still in their head. They had just watched him curse a fig tree, and then the next day the fig tree's dead. And that fig tree represented Israel. So that event was he came to Israel looking for fruit. There was no fruit. The fig tree died, but now he's talking about the fig tree coming back again. And so I think it's also hard, other than just the general signs of his coming. This will tie into the question that got asked online. Also, we see the specifics of Israel. Now, many people over the years then have taken this as somewhat of a formula or a recipe. Well, the birth of Israel is the rebirth of the fig tree. Therefore, if we can just determine what a generation is and tack that on to the end, we'll know that the second coming should be before that time. This is how we ended up with like 88 reasons the rapture is happening in 1988. And some of the people who've been trying to pinpoint the date of the rapture and trying to figure these things out. The hard thing with this generation shall pass away. First, if you take it as a literal physical generation, if that's what we're talking about. Well, is it 40 years? Is it 80 years? Is it the lifespan? Is it the span? So there's all these different things. I actually wrote down here, a generation in the wilderness was basically 40 years or 38 years. That generation passed away within that period of time. In Genesis 15:16, it makes reference to a generation. You do the math, it comes out to 66 years. But then does it start in 1948 when they got Jerusalem? Does it start it became a nation, 1967 when they retook Jerusalem, their capital? Does it start in 2017 when America recognized Jerusalem as the capital? There's all these funny things you can look into. But here's the other hard part is that word generation The word genos in the Greek, it can also actually just mean like genes, genetics, this race of people. And so some say, well, it's not necessarily so much talking about the time period of a generation, but the generation, the people, the gene pool of the Jews, they're not going to pass away before this happens. The idea being is another way this can be interpreted is basically just saying that these people aren't going anywhere and they're not going to pass away no matter how grim it looks. And that even still ties back in with the rebirth of Israel and stuff in the latter days. And so I will say, I don't think you can pinpoint times necessarily from this verse because there's too many variables and ways can be interpreted. And I'm one, I don't like getting specific when I don't think the Bible is clear enough for me to be, well, it's this year, it's 40 years plus this, so the date's going to be somewhere in this window. I'll say this too. I think a lot of people, as many of you have been going to this church, you know, like, I believe in the rapture of the church. I believe in the pre-tribulational rapture of the church. I believe it because of the Bible, and I believe it because of many other reasons. But I think when people start date setting and building up hype around, well, it's been 40 years since 1948, and then it doesn't happen, I think a lot of people have left that position, and in my opinion, good theology, because of disappointment. When people start saying dates and the dates don't happen, people get discouraged and start abandoning ship. Well, you told us it was this time, then you told us this time, then you told us this time. I'm just going to go over here to this camp where they're not making those claims. And so it's tough when you try and date set. But someone did ask, because, based on the state of the world, so this is another question, but it ties, how close do you think we are to Jesus' second coming? All right, let me do some date setting now. No. But I will say this, some of you have done this with me before. I don't have it prepared tonight, but if you use the Bible almost alone, if you use the dates that are pretty much universally accepted as the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, and then you use your Bible and nothing but your Bible, you can count backwards using nothing but Bible verses all the way to creation. And you can actually date creation to like the year 3996 BC. I want to say that's off the top of my head. And there's like the 1500 and some odd years to the flood. The flood was right around, I'm rounding 1600 BC. You can move forward just using the genealogies and other things they talk about. If you do that though, do the math now. If you go backwards, it's 3,970 something. However it comes out, the year today from creation, according to the Bible, would be like the year 6001, 2, 3, right around there. And a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. I'll be honest, that's one of the biggest things for me on the second coming of Jesus. Has always actually been creation in the Bible. We have 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. The Bible speaks of 1,000 years of the millennial kingdom, Revelation, 1,000 years, 6,000 years of the earth one way, we get 1,000 years the other. The Jews taught this. This is like in the Jewish writings, they talk about it very explicitly. In fact, the Jews, here's a cool thing. It's a Jewish interpretation of Hosea, where it talks about how for 2 days he has stricken us, and in the third day he will revive us. 2,000 years of the Jews being stricken, and then on the 1,000th year, they'll be revived. There we have 2,000 years since Christ, 1,000-year millennial kingdom. This is Jewish stuff, not Christian stuff. And they talk about how they believe that the world would be 2,000 years of lawlessness, 2,000 years of law, and 2,000 years of Messiah. That's what they taught. 2,000 years before the giving of the law of Moses. So it's lawlessness in the sense of there was no Mosaic law, which Abraham came at 2000 BC. So from 4,000 to 2,000. Now Abraham kind of begins the kickoff of the Jewish nation. For 2,000 years, they have their people, and they believe for 2,000 years. And then this was actually written a few hundred years after Jesus, but they say, but because of our disobedience, Messiah has delayed. Because they thought Jesus was supposed to show up right around 0, and he didn't, according to them. So there's some really cool stuff. So as far as people asking, looking around the world today, the signs are there. There's cool things you can do, different ways you can come to the same conclusions. I struggle when trying to invest long term because I realize, man, I'm going to keep living life in 2 different ways. I'm going to plan like I'm going to live forever, but at the same time, I'm going to try and live day by day like I have no tomorrow. That's the reality is I need to make sure my time is used wisely that it is a precious thing for me to try and use as best as I can. But I make long-term decisions, so if he tarries, I'm not being foolish. But on the other side, using our time wisely, because yes, Jesus could come back at any moment. Oh, I know. It'd be great just to trust the Lord. I will say this. For the most part, the pre-tribulational position is the only people who can be waiting for Jesus. Because any other end times view, you're kind of waiting for the Antichrist, you're waiting for the mark of the beast, you're waiting for all these other things in Revelation. You're waiting for those things. You can't say, I could not say Jesus could come at any time if I held a different view because, well, I haven't seen the mark of the beast yet. I haven't seen all these things yet. I haven't seen the seal judgments yet. I haven't seen the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgment. So depending on your different end times views, that's one thing that also is a factor is like, I think Jesus could come at any time. And we're waiting for Jesus. The blessed hope is looking for Jesus. And so there's a lot of good scriptures I have in little lists I have compiled elsewhere, just all the verses about they're waiting for Jesus, looking for Jesus, expecting Jesus. And that was really the theme of the early church, was looking and waiting for Jesus. And so that's what I'm doing, looking and waiting for Jesus, just that it could be at any time. Yes. So here's the thing. It's kind of a fun fact. So Peter says that in his epistle, but Peter is not, but beloved, 2 Peter 3:8, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as 1 day. Here's the catch. Peter, in his epistle, is speaking of the timelessness of God, that God's outside of time. That's his point when Peter says this in 2 Peter 3, that the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, the next verse, as some count slackness, but he's long-suffering toward us. And he's not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance. 2 Peter 3 is all about scoffers in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, mocking the church. Where is the promise of his coming? Why isn't he here yet? Could you believe that one day people are going to mock the church asking why Jesus hasn't come yet? Yeah, and for this, they willfully forget. On purpose, they choose to forget essentially creation and the flood, summarizing these verses. So he's trying to encourage the church, I'm answering your question, a long roundabout way, is don't worry, God's got everything under control. His timing is perfect. He's got this on lockdown. Don't forget. Well, you don't say don't forget to someone unless they already knew, right? When Peter's saying a day is like 1,000 years, that was already a Jewish teaching. We don't have that in the Bible. It wasn't a Bible verse that he could refer to explicitly. There's a psalm that the Jews use, but it was a common teaching of the rabbis. They had what psalm is it? There is a psalm where it talks about how a day is like 1,000 years, and it's used, and they took that, and the Jews actually believe days representing 1,000-year period. They use that in some of their interpretation. But Peter was talking about something that his readers and the other disciples would have been familiar with, this phrase, a day is like 1,000 years, whether you're taking it very literally or not. What it's never been to the church was an excuse of well, creation is 7 days, and that represents all these long periods of time. No, it would represent 7,000 years, not millions, because they took it quite literally. If they were using it in that kind of interpretive way, they meant literally 1,000 years. But Peter was basically just saying, God's got this whole thing under control. Remember, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. The backwards was not a common teaching. He kind of dropped in that second part, just basically saying, God's got the timeline all figured out. Don't worry about God. He's not slack concerning his promise that he's going to come. He's not being lazy. Why has Jesus not come? By a raise of hands, who would not be going with us if Jesus had came 5 years ago? Come on, who's been a Christian less than? I see one. People, not you, you're my wife. Go away. There's people here. Okay, 10 years, 20 years. If Jesus had come in 1988, would you have gone, right? No, right? Well, I would have, because I would have been a little kid, so I would get into that, age of accountability thing. But some of you weren't born, some of you weren't saved. So that's kind of the point, though, is that Peter's just trying to encourage them. Day with the Lord's 1,000 years, 1,000 years a day. God's got the timing on lockdown. He's not being slack or lazy. He's long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. All right. I'm slowly winding down. So if you've got a question that so we got to have that up so people can see questions. Whoa. From the back. Do animals go to heaven? Is that the one you're asking? No, wait. That is the one you're asking. Okay. Do animals go to heaven? I'm going to hurt someone's feelings. Now they know my answer already. Is that a good enough answer? I don't want to hurt. So here's the thing with creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bara Bereshit, right? Bereshit bara Elohim. Bara. In the beginnings, God created. Bara is a unique word. That means ex nihilo, is Latin, right? Out of nothing. Out of nothing, God created the heavens and the earth. You're going to get a little creation story. I'm trying to sideswipe the question. No, God created everything. And I think at that point, every atom, every molecule was created. But it was all kind of just out there. He created light, which I think is probably the best way to describe energy. Second law of thermodynamics, right? The energy cannot be created just dwindling down. We have a certain amount of energy in the universe, and it's only getting lower. Law of entropy, going downwards. Okay? Which one? Third law? Thank you, Caleb. This is why we have the chemist on board. Okay. And so God created everything. He begins to form stuff. If I take these atoms and those atoms and put them together, I can make the earth, and he forms the earth. And I can do this, and I make the seas, and I can make trees, I can make stars. But on the fifth day, we see bara again. He creates animals which are living in his eyes, but that's different from trees. Biblically, trees are not alive. Break that to your hippie friends. Biblically, they have to have the breath of life in them. It has to be a living thing, an animal. They procreate. They have to. Okay. And then on day 6, we see bara, the third and last time, when mankind was made. Because while animals had a spirit, there's a life to them, emotions and thought, but only mankind had a soul. So when man was made, we see the third bara. And if you were here last Sunday night, we talked about the Trinity, and we talked about our triune nature of body, soul, and spirit. And in the New Testament, exclusively, whenever you're being warned, do not fear who can kill the body, but who can kill the soul. What good is it to gain the whole world, but then to lose your soul? The eternal part of us is our soul. And the sad part, and you can, this is a reason to find a new church, okay, is the Bible does not say animals have souls. Now, there is horses in heaven because Jesus comes back riding on one. I said this morning there's cats in heaven because there's harps. If you don't get that, that's okay. Okay? So here's what I can guarantee is that the Bible doesn't say animals have souls, so I cannot guarantee that animals go to heaven except for your pets. If you guys have pets, they'll go to heaven. And if I'm wrong, I'll talk to God about that later. So your pets, just yours, will go to heaven. No one else's. Because if ants went to heaven, there would be bazillions of ants in heaven. Because that's the other thing about animals that's hard, is that, again, like, what's the criteria then if animals go to heaven? Are they saved or not saved? I mean, this is, because there's a big ball of wax, because God created animals. He did, but because what would be the criteria then? Would every animal go to heaven? Do all dogs go to heaven? Do you know how many dogs there'd be in heaven? That's a lot of dogs. You know, that must be why the New Jerusalem is so big, if you ever studied that, right? Because you got to make room for all the dogs. But, so that's the reality, is that biblically, I think creation is helpful. That matter was created out of nothing, and then animal life had that word again because they were spiritual. They were alive. They were different than all created things prior to them, but then when mankind was created, it was different. We are different. And so, I will also say this, is that no matter how much you love your dog, if you've ever had an actual human child, the day the baby's born, the moment that they lay the child on the mother's chest, you're not thinking about your dog, right? And if you do, you have problems. And when we go to heaven, what will be before us, the greatness of it and the splendor and the awe, we won't be thinking, honestly, this is the answer for what about lost loved ones and all this and that. I'm going to tell you, in the moment when that baby is laid on your chest, women are pretty messed up, are they not, ladies? What you just went through. You're in sad shape right now after just delivering a baby, but in the moment that baby's in your arms, you're not thinking about that. All the mean yelling my wife has been doing, this is your baby, you should take it, slapping, hitting, clawing, tearing, pull. I just make a guy. But the point is that, but the second the baby's born, all that's gone. She's still in pain. She's still gone through this traumatic experience, but you don't think about it. And so the thing we can rest assured, whether it's our pets or loved ones who we knew weren't believers, when we get to heaven, we won't be concerned about it because of what's before us. It's not necessarily that we forget, but it's just that idea that there'll be something so good and so awesome that we won't be hurting and we won't be worried. And